All right. Well, I'm sure some folks will continue to join over the next couple of minutes, but in order to maximize our time, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on 21st Century Civic Infrastructure. My name is Kristen Campbell, and I'm with PACE, Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement. I am honored to convene today's webinar in partnership with the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions and the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund, as well as with the convening support of the Neighborhood Funders Group. For those who are not familiar with PACE, we are an affinity group of foundations that seek to understand the importance of civic engagement and democratic practice and illuminate broadly why it is worthy of philanthropic investment. We are a membership-based organization, and we convene our members for learning and sharing and discussion with each other in order to help advance their work. We also venture to provide a platform for our members to share their work with a broader audience, which is what brings us here today. I remember the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions and Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund recently commissioned Jill Blair and Malka Kopel to research and write a paper that explores the strengths and challenges of our civic infrastructure and how it exists today. So with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleague Sherry Brady at Aspen to talk a little bit about why they commissioned this paper and what they hope it will achieve. Sherry?
Great. Thanks, Kristen, and welcome to everyone for joining us today. The Aspen Forum for Community Solutions mission is really to support community collaboration to really help communities effectively address their own pressing problems. And, you know, we do this in a variety of ways, including developing knowledge and network development, mobilizing stakeholders, removing barriers, and advocating for effective policies, and catalyzing investments by encouraging funder partnerships. But one of the things that came up as we were talking about this with the members of our Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund, which is the first funding collaborative that we have started here, and some of our funders was really thinking about what kind of infrastructures exist to help communities and to help people engage in public policy making. And so we really wanted to think about what is civic infrastructure, what does it look like in the 21st century. Steve Patrick, our executive director, called it the Tocqueville 2.0 in his conversation, which I have to admit, when he first said that, kind of gave me a little bit of as a poli-sci major, I was like, I've read the Tocqueville. I don't know if we're ready to take that on. But we really started having conversations with Jill and then Malka to really think about what are the keystones and what are things that we need to think about as we want to be intentional about building a civic infrastructure. And our main audience ended up being, on some level, philanthropy, because as civic infrastructure exists today, it's really, philanthropy has played a big part in building what exists today by investing in what they were concerned about, what are the ideas that they wanted to move forward, and they put money toward that. So we have this hodgepodge is not quite right, but it sort of works system that really is meeting some needs, but not all, especially those at the margin, based on sort of the needs of where philanthropy has invested in over time. So they became sort of this paper. The goal of this was really to help philanthropy think about that. How do you build an intentional? I think intentionality is an important part, as those of you who have read the paper know, for this piece, and really helping to challenge the sector, not just philanthropy, but the sector as a whole, to think about how we really be thoughtful and intentional about engaging all folks to be able to engage in public policy making and in the civic infrastructure and being intentional about that. So I wanted to say that's sort of what we were thinking. And so really the idea of this paper was really to be a thought piece and to start the conversations. And we are thinking about sort of what we do with the next steps and helping people assess where they are and where they might go and how they put these into practice. They are deceptively simplistic, I think, is what someone once said about them. They seem like they seem to be logical in what you should be doing, but it seems to be hard to actually put into practice. So we wanted to start this as a thought piece and really get people's input and to see how it resonated and thoughts with this. And so I will turn it back to Kristen to introduce our speakers to really sort of help us with that conversation, and we hope that you'll engage with us in a way that does that and really help us move this to the next level. So thank you. And I'm actually going to turn off my camera so that you're not watching me the entire time, I don't think, while Jill and Malka are speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Sherry. So let me give you a little bit of an overview about how today's webinar will work. I'm going to turn things over to Jill and Malka in just a second, and they will share a brief presentation of the paper and its Keystone findings. We hope that you guys have had an opportunity to review it in advance, so they're going to go over some of the high-level pieces of the paper. Then we're going to open it up for discussion with you all about your reactions to the paper and if and how the keystones of the paper apply to your philanthropic practice. Some of you have pre-submitted questions for today, which we're very thankful for, and Jill and Malka have ventured to incorporate some of those into their presentation, but I also have them available here and we can refer to them along the way. We also really want to encourage real-time Q&A. As you might have seen in some of the materials that went out, we really want this to be an interactive and engaging discussion. So as soon as the presentation concludes, I will give a few details about how that live Q&A will work. We have about 30 to 35 minutes for that part of the discussion, so it should be a really great opportunity to engage. Throughout the presentation, I encourage you to utilize the chat feature, and I see a number of folks have started taking advantage of that already. But that's just a great opportunity to communicate and share with each other, all the participants that are on the call, as well as the presenters on the webinar as well. So feel free to make comments, ask questions, share resources or links that you think might be beneficial for the group as they relate to the topics in this discussion. Finally, a recording of this webinar and a transcript of the chat will be made available upon conclusion. So with that, I think that's all of our housekeeping. I think we're ready to get started. So by way of very brief introductions, Jill Blair is a longtime consultant with nonprofits and philanthropy. She has her own practice, Jill Blair Consulting, and prior to venturing out on her own, she was co-founder and principal of Informing Change. Jill is also the founding director of PACE and our predecessor, the Grantmakers Forum for Community and National Service. Malka Koppel is the founder of several civic nonprofits, including Community Focus and the Civity Initiative. She also has a philanthropic background, having served as a program officer at the Hewlett Foundation and the first managing director of the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford. So, ladies, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. And thanks again to PACE and to the Neighborhood Funders Group and to Aspen for giving us this opportunity to speak. It's really, I looked at the list of attendees, and I recognize some longtime colleagues and friends, and I know that many of you on this webinar are basically living, breathing examples of what we're talking about. So this should be fun. I'm going to, as Kristen said, I'm going to start by giving you some highlights from the paper, but we really want this to be a discussion. And I'm going to use a PowerPoint to take us through it. Let me load it.
Based on the comments that have already come in, it looks like we've got a ready group.
Yeah. So why don't we start by talking about what we mean by civic infrastructure, and as you all know, we mean the systems and structures in our society that have assembled in the civic space. And that system spans all three sectors, although it has traditionally been housed and expressed in the public and the nonprofit sector. So, for example, to our civic infrastructure, the public sector contributes government, the nonprofit sector contributes programs that support members of our society, and the private sector has historically contributed financially and has more lately been in developing its own programs and contributions to the civic infrastructure, from charter schools to employee volunteer programs. The civic infrastructure enables civic capacity to create and sustain smart collective action. Like physical infrastructure, civic infrastructure is built. That's the key point. We can build it, we can rebuild it. It is built and it can be improved. And it can also become obsolete and outdated. It can work or it can fail to work. The civic infrastructure we have today was designed pretty much in sectoral silos, which at the time served it well. Each sector determined its own role in the civic infrastructure. But we feel that the 21st century brings us new challenges and also new opportunities to rebuild our civic infrastructure. The challenges are that more and more people are being left out of our decision-making process, out of our infrastructure, the way it's being built now, and left out of the politics of the public good. But the new opportunities include new opportunities to learn more and to engage more people more quickly, as many of you know and are working on, and to do so better than we ever have in the past. So our call to action really is that we need to rebuild and improve our civic infrastructure, just like our physical infrastructure, to bring it into the 21st century. It's not a no-brainer. Many of you who have watched states and local governments try to get support for building physical infrastructure know how difficult this can be. But we feel, like the physical infrastructure, that civic infrastructure is necessary. Not sufficient, but necessary to solve the problems that we're trying to solve today. So we offered the idea that the new civic infrastructure should be built on 3 keystones. And by keystones, we mean, like the cornerstone of a building, the cornerstone of our infrastructure. Keystones that are essential if we want to solve public problems in ways that take advantage of all of us and all that we can do together. So the 3 keystones that we believe that the civic infrastructure should be built on are these. It should engage all sectors, it should enlist all voices, and it should build vertical and horizontal thoroughfares of knowledge. I'll talk about those in a second. Okay, the first, engaging all sectors. So as I mentioned, the 3 sectors have already contributed to the current civic infrastructure, but primarily in silos. For the 21st century, we believe that we need to engage all 3 across each other. And the question is not whether, but how can we involve all the sectors and when. One example of we mentioned in the paper, of engaging all sectors is the Collective Impact Initiative. And there we see growing appreciation both for the benefits and the challenges of trying to work together across sector. I know that many of you are also deeply engaged in this work. We have some questions up here that when we think about engaging all sectors, questions that we can ask ourselves. When? Why don't we? What is the benefit? And what is the cost? Second keystone, enlisting all voices. Societal divides are continuing to grow. Our current infrastructure at times has been organized and set up to leave people out or to overrepresent certain segments of our society. And this can even happen in our sector when our nonprofits begin to not just substitute for, but supplant the voices of the people that they exist to represent. As we rebuild our civic infrastructure, we believe that all voices should be heard. In the 21st century, there's really no excuse for this not to happen. We have the technology now to know what people feel, believe, and experience. We're seeing this more and more. Some nonprofits are engaging residents directly in designing programs and redesigning them. I hope we'll hear from them later in this call. And some community foundations are asking residents to contribute their voice to describe the community that they want to see. This is what we mean by enlisting all voices. Here are some questions that we can ask ourselves when we do that. And then the final keystone is building vertical and horizontal thoroughfares. This is rooted in the opportunity that we have to transfer knowledge. Today's technology allows us to learn more about more things, but we're missing important opportunities to share that knowledge. One example is the work that's been done in climate change. There are there are two main streams of work. One is changing national policy and international policy, and the other is being done on the ground by communities trying to reduce their carbon footprint. At the moment, those two movements are moving forward separately without communicating much with one another, and we believe there could be a benefit to building vertical thoroughfares there, moving knowledge from one movement to another, but also engaging people across the movements, engaging local people in the national and international conversation and vice versa. That's an example of a vertical thoroughfare. The horizontal thoroughfares are about learning from our peers, not only across sectors, but across institutions. And here are some questions we can ask ourselves when we look at our work in building vertical and horizontal thoroughfares. Are we learning? Who are we sharing our learning with? And who are we learning from? I'm going to turn it over to Jill to kick off the discussion.
Thank you, Malka. Well, I am seeing quite a lot of activity online, so that is great. I think this group has a sense of why it is that we were interested in this question, and how important it is that we have a conversation and try to turn these ideas both into practice and find the practice that already exists. So Malka and I have actually asked Gwen Barley from the Colorado Trust, who was one of the people that we spoke with in preparing the paper, if she might be willing to kick off our conversation today by sharing her reflections on 21st century civic infrastructure. Gwen, are you with us?
There. Say that, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
All right, so say that again, because it was fussing with my line to unmute it.
Just asking you, acknowledging your contributions to our thinking around the paper and asking you if you might share your own thoughts and experience from where you sit on the value and need and manifestation of 21st century civic infrastructure.
Sure. So the Colorado Trust is a health conversion foundation. We're 30 years old. We're the first health conversion foundation in Colorado. And for the past 30 years, we've looked like a traditional funder in pretty much the healthcare space. And we really came to recognize that, sort of in foundation vernacular, we were not moving the needle. We were not changing the lived experiences of people's lives in our state in the ways that we had hoped to. And we launched an initiative around health equity, and really decided that in order to do this, we had to do it very, very differently as a foundation, that we couldn't just kind of continue to do our work in the same way. So we reorganized our entire staff. We no longer have program officers. We have community partners who live throughout Colorado and who directly engage residents, and not only engage, but put them in the driver's seat. So we're no longer here in Denver saying we know what the its are, or we know what the problems are, and we know what the solutions are. We recognize that communities and people around Colorado have different needs and different priorities around solving health inequities. So we very intentionally reorganized ourselves. We've embedded ourselves into places throughout Colorado, and we're working directly with residents who are determining in foundation speak, they are the ones saying what the theory of change is and what the desire, what is it that they see as the priorities and issues in their community for advancing and creating health equity, and how do they want to go about doing that. And we'll give, instead of giving money to the nonprofit sector, we'll give the money directly then to those communities to decide how they want to use those funds as they've described in their theory of change. So that's the cornerstone of our work. We're doing some other things as well, and I'd be happy to talk about that.
That is a great example of 21st century civic infrastructure, and I'm noting Lisa Wilson's comment that came up about the obstacle here is creating false hope. You know, what does real engagement look like? And I think one of the things that we have to confront, and one of the reasons why some of the critique that we've gotten for the paper is, well, these are obvious, but the reality is that executing them authentically is not obvious and not easy. So what Gwen is describing is a whole new way of doing business. It's not just giving grants the same way to slightly different folks for slightly different reasons, but rather rethinking how we're working as well as what work we're doing.
Yep.
Does anybody else want to, I'm seeing a lot going on in the chat space. Would anybody like to speak up to some of these questions that are, and comments that are being made so we can hear your voice?
And just as a technical note on how we can hear your voice, if you are engaging in the microphone on your computer, everyone when you joined was put in a default Q&A mode, which means you are muted by default. So to unmute yourself, if you have dialed in through the computer, at the top of your screen, you should see a little mic button that has a slash through it. If you click that, it should remove your slash and allow you to speak. And then alternately, if you're dialed in on the phone, I think you should be able to just speak that way and mute and unmute yourself as you normally would on the phone. Also, if you'd like to kind of enter a queue to help us manage some questions, again, if you're on the computer, if you click the More tab, it should, the Interact tab. You can click Raise Hand and it'll put you in a queue so we can help moderate folks who want to speak should we have lots of interest.
While we're waiting, I also want to acknowledge Shelley Hamilton's comment in response to Bruce's comment to say that what we're trying to express with the very concept of 21st century civic infrastructure is democratizing. That is leveraging all the capacity we have to democratize the political process and to take the power away from the few and take the risk of giving the power to the many. And one of the questions that we have been asked is, you know, are we prepared to hear or support voices of opposition with whom we don't agree? I do want to be that value of an underpinning of the work that we're talking about. That is to say, Malka and I do believe in the value of the collective and appreciate that we have to work our way through differences and that is the nature of a pluralistic society. So we're in.
Great. Thanks, Jill. One of the other questions that came up when you started speaking about the execution and the challenges of execution, one of the questions that also came up in the pre-submitted questions was the challenge of execution when it comes to scope and to scale. So can you guys talk a little bit about how some of the needs or challenges of building a civic infrastructure might vary on a local level versus a regional, statewide, or national level?
Malka, do you want to?
Sure, and I think that there are others in the audience who could speak to this as well. I think that these three keystones apply to really to any level, but that even in a national level, you can especially around a specific issue, you can engage all sectors. It's difficult to enlist all voices, but you can do a better job of that than has been done in the past. And there's certainly the opportunity for transferring knowledge vertically and horizontally. But I think that at the local level, there's a special opportunity for building civic infrastructure in this way. And those of you who are doing place-based work know that. If building civic infrastructure focuses on a place, And, you know, really building civic infrastructure means connecting everything, just like building physical infrastructure is putting things together. But once you make those connections at a place, in a community, those connections can stay. And they stay even after the issue that connected people in the first place is over. It stays through to the next issue because the people and the institutions in that place, as you know, are constantly coming connecting to each other and interacting with each other just because they're in the same place.
And I guess I want to piggyback on that to say that some of the questions that have been coming up and issues that are coming up relate to the practicality of time that's needed to achieve the level of trust one needs to really work collectively in a productive way. And I think this is, again, another example. Like, it's not just doing business a little differently, it's doing business a lot differently. So what is the horizon, the time horizon, for the kind of civic engagement that we are talking about trying to promote with these keystones? The horizon is generational. You know, maybe we could do it in 10 years, but I think that we need to be thinking in generational terms, and that the work that we do needs to be slow and steady. So when you bring people together, it's not having one difficult conversation, it's learning over time how to have many difficult conversations. That speaks to some of the challenges that people have had in trying to work across sectors where there's so much distrust. You know, it's really over time that we're going to measure our ability to make change. And over time that we're going to begin to create our shared concept of the common good. I think that that's part of what we are living without right now. You know, what does the common good actually, what is it really composed of?
Yeah. Jill, another question that came up in chat, but there were also a couple that were pre-submitted around it, was the role of education and how community colleges or higher ed or even K-12 education could really be kind of a sector in itself when you think about engaging all sectors. So let me find it because there's been some good chatter. I'm going to have to scroll up a little bit. But Martine from Colorado said, you don't mention universities when you talk about intermediaries. Curious on your thoughts on their potential and as sites for building civic infrastructure. So maybe if you could speak a little bit to the higher ed piece, but also community colleges and K-12, which were brought up in some of the pre-submitted questions as well, that would be interesting.
You want to take that?
Go ahead.
Oh, well, so I started my career in public education, and I did a lot of work in secondary education when we were living in Seattle. So I have a kind of a bias here, which is that our educational institutions are incredibly rich venues for the kind of civic infrastructure that we need to cultivate, both because of their role in educating next generation, but also because they are the meeting ground. And I'll speak specifically to community colleges, so frequently the meeting ground for business, the public sector, and the interests of future generations. So they can serve as venues and as hosts for the kinds of conversations that need to happen. They're also obvious resources in terms of the research that we need on the issues that we need to deliberate. One example that Malka and I have some familiarity with that's operating right now, that's being piloted right now, is something called the Citizen Cabinet. If you don't know it, you might want to look at it, organized by the Voice of the People. And the Citizen Cabinet is what it sounds like. On a congressional district by congressional district basis, a group of people are brought together and work through policy simulations. It's deep work, and it's over time that they do that work. But it's an example of method that could be used and hosted by something like a community college, where the research that's necessary to inform policy deliberation can be done by faculty and students. That's great. Where they have the credibility within the community to bring people together in a kind of nonpartisan, non-ideological manner, that's great. Where they have influence with the employment sector as well as the public sector, that's great. So I think educational institutions have a huge potential role to play in this framework.
Great, thanks, Jill. We're seeing some other comments about education come into the chat box. Does anyone want to speak up and maybe re-articulate something that they've shared in the chat for folks who are only joining on the phone, or to bring any new questions into the conversation? I want to make sure you guys are fully engaged in this discussion.
Hi, this is Rachel from the Close-Up Foundation. I just wanted to say that I do agree with Bruce, and I want to just draw a very bright highlight on his comment of a lot of the citizens that we're seeking to reach the most are in school districts and communities where teachers are not well resourced to do the kind of work that needs to be done and set the groundwork for good civic education, dialogue, discussion of controversial issues. It's in those schools in particular where there's more emphasis on standardized testing, where there's more emphasis on schools not making annual, yearly progress. So I think there's definitely room for this community to think about reaching back into K-12 schools, particularly in disadvantaged areas, because their peers who are more advantaged, we have lots of good studies showing that they do in fact have lots of opportunities to participate and amplify their voice, whereas some of these folks that we're looking to reach as adults, they don't have that opportunity as students.
Hear, hear.
Rachel, I wonder if part of what you're talking about is K-12 schools as anchors of engagement, or using the school as the organizing base for community. Is that part of what you're suggesting?
Yes, I think that ideally the role of the public school should be that anchor and that base for the community, and could be the start of where you engage parents and students and future parents around the idea of civic infrastructure. And it's hard to do that right now with the way things are set up. But I do agree with what Ethan just posted here as well, is that, basic civics would help. And there is a need for that, but also building trust within these communities who see the government very much as other and often the cause of problems, or in a maybe happier light, not the cause of problems, but certainly not any organization that's going to help with solutions.
So you just triggered for me my great hobby horse, because somebody had submitted a question about what's the role of storytelling, and I would argue that the diminution of our civics education, our commitment to civics education in our public K-12 system, has really been a very big contributor to where we sit today in terms of people having so little confidence. And perhaps even before confidence, so little understanding of what the role and purpose of government really was intended to be. And so I think that one of the narratives that we're lacking, and I get that there are values embedded here, but I'm prepared to have the conversation, is the narrative about the history of our nation and the aspiration of this country, not yet realized, but nevertheless unique and important. So I think I agree with the idea that looking at schools as an anchor institution and investing in opportunities for schools to be in relation to other community institutions and focused on the roles and power of citizenry as originally conceived in the founding of the country, and the role of public institutions in representing the best interest of the people, and our responsibility as citizens to make sure that that happens.
Yeah, and I want to add, and many people have made this point, that that resources are an important piece of this. I mean, that it's just like physical infrastructure, we need resources to build trust or to build, create the relationships that form the basis of trust. So a lot of people brought up trust and distrust, and different parts of our society see each other as the other. And that's the way the civic infrastructure has been built so far. That is civic infrastructure. It's bad civic infrastructure. And I think to chip away at it and to rebuild it requires a remaking of those relationships, as Jill said, over time. It's going to take a while, and that requires the participants, the conveners, to be able to have the resources to show up over and over again to create the relationships and to create this time and space to really see each other as part of the same community.
Somebody's asking about, is there an open source course, Civics 101 as a curriculum for K-12? I don't know the answer. If anybody has the answer, they should share it. I do know that that the Broadway show / hit Hamilton is having a huge impact in New York City and among the New York City public education community, students and faculty, in that it introduces the founding of the country from a multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralistic perspective, and really kind of connects the present to the past in ways that are really powerful and influential. And I guess I commend that work, and I actually think that it's a great way to reach future generations with some of the past that matters so much.
Thanks, Rachel, for being the first person to speak out on the call. I want to invite and encourage others to raise questions that you might have to Jill and Malka.
Or share comments and examples.
Hi, this is John Dedrick. Good to see you, Jill, Malka, Kristen, and all the great comments on the line. I am curious about Jill and Malka, you're all thinking about to what extent building a civic infrastructure 2.0 is, in fact, very countercultural to American philanthropy now. Malka, you've written eloquently in SSIR on foundations' interest in control and the need to let go. And Jill, am I coming through?
Yes, you are.
Okay, and Jill, much of the work you've done has also addressed issues of how we invest in commons. And all of the elements of the infrastructure really, to the extent philanthropy can play a role in it, require philanthropy to let go at the same time when there is so much emphasis on measurement, performance, short-term return, involvement of philanthropy in the governance and functioning of the organizations that it is in fact investing in. So I'm just very curious to hear your sense of to what extent you see this as in fact countercultural to trends in philanthropy and how those of us involved with PACE and other groups might address some of the countercultural trends.
Well, John, thank you. I mean, I do think that it is countercultural, but here we have a stealth strategy that's going to hook on to the cultural trends in philanthropy, which is the Enlisting All Voices Keystone. What is true is that there is a growing movement within philanthropy of appreciating the value of constituency voice. And it started kind of with a navel-gazing effort, which I don't mean to diminish. I mean, I think it's a great effort by the Center for Effective Philanthropy in the creation of the Grantee Perception Report, and also the work that they do with foundations to assess internally how the foundation is doing. So that's a kind of constituency voice effort. At the Hewlett Foundation, they took leadership in creating the Fund for Shared Insight, which is doing a collaborative initiative across many foundations to listen for good, both to support the research on listen for good and also the practice of it. That is, enabling nonprofits to hear from the ultimate beneficiaries of the services they deliver. And I encourage all of us to pay a lot of attention to that work, because that is a kind of civic infrastructure investment, and I think we can put pressure and promote the value of listening to the people and enlisting the people whose lives we're actually trying to change. And I agree with you too. It challenges the idea that all we need are metrics and really expensive consulting firms to tell us how to solve our public problems. It counters that.
I don't know if the tide has completely turned, but I would say that I personally felt very hopeful working on this paper and talking with the people that we talk to, who see basically, a chance as funders, a chance to be more effective in their work by engaging more voices, by working across sector. And that's really, I think that's the carrot that we're holding up. I mean, it's part of the change that I've seen has been born of frustration, that we're not able to make the improvements in our society that we want to make by doing the same things that we've been doing. But the good news is that sometimes frustration can inspire people to try new things. I think that maybe I'm just an optimist, but I see some of this also in our current political divides, which there's great frustration out there. But I think that for those of us who have been looking at the role of government and how it is perceived by Americans, I personally am heartened because the conversation has changed from who's government, what is it doing, how does it even relate to what I need to do in my life, to how can it work better? It's not working well now. We need to change it, change the way it works. And I think that's hopeful.
I guess I want to go back to John to see if we could get him back online to share with us what his observations are, what he thinks. Are we being Pollyanna-ish, or does he have what his thoughts are about the question that he asked us?
Okay, I have to say, Jill, I heard you and I got cut offline during Malka's reply. So, Malka, apologies for missing you. So I'm afraid anything I offer now is not going to be helpful. Jill, I think the examples you're offering are really helpful, and that there's a lot we can do to lift up, make visible, and make it's sometimes small and large investments in efforts to build the infrastructure for civic engagement and to move, and what I think is a significant challenge for us all as a field, to move from high-quality events to a set of norms and practices that continue beyond events to routines in politics. I do think, and PACE, which Kristen and I, all of us, many of us have been part of, has worked on this. I do think that that we need, in some sense, to be sober about the accountability environment and the pressures towards short-term funding cycles that accountability can put on us, that make the longer-term investments in building a civic infrastructure difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Thanks,
think that
John.
Yes, go ahead.
I'll mute myself again.
Go ahead, Jill.
Well, I was just going to say that yeah, I mean, what we're talking about is having a long-term vision for the country. I mean, it's about the future of the nation, and I don't think it's that hard to get people to appreciate that we're not in a good place in terms of confidence in government, in terms of social contracts. Where is it? What is it? What should it be? And that we've tried for a long time in philanthropy, to operate on 3-year funding cycles, and it just isn't working. So we have a combination of a lot of efforts that have failed in with short-term horizons, and a lot of problems that persist. So I guess we're offering a different way.
Yes, you are.
I'd like to ask again, many of you I know have been working on doing these things, in some cases for years. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing from you, how do you see the future? What gets you up in the morning? Do you see hopeful things going on out there?
This is Lisa calling in from Georgia. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, Lisa.
Okay. I think there's someone that has some background noise. That's not me. I'm just saying that. But I do want to say I do think there's an unfolding opportunity for philanthropy, public policy makers, and the NGO community as we think about these public engagement processes. So the example I brought up in the Clean Power Plan is that you've got a mandated process by air regulators to require that there's meaningful engagement by the citizens of their state in their voices in this eventual thing that they will have to turn into the EPA, yet $0 attached to actually doing meaningful engagement. So they're destined to just do what they know how to do, which is public hearings, right?
Right.
And so where we've been able to be successful is to literally say, if we pull together a network of networks approach, leverage private philanthropy, help you co-create and co-design a process, are you interested in that? And it's something we're beginning to see some success in. I think the breaking point here, though, is many of the public policymakers, as you all know, are very risk-averse and slow. And so oftentimes they're working on these timelines that are, fast when it comes to aligning citizens around a collective impact strategy. And so I think there's some additional, I would just say, I think there's an opportunity here, and maybe this goes back to what Gwen was talking about. I do think there's an opportunity here to continue to lift up for public policymakers where nonprofit and private philanthropy have come together to augment public processes, essentially paying the bill for those engagement processes, to say, hey, guess what? It doesn't have to be that scary. You can do it, and it does result in something that is actually more meaningful and a better policy in the long run.
Yeah, this is Gwen Barley at the Colorado Trust, and can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Great. For us, we had to get out of the engagement business. I think residents are tired of being engaged, and we heard that over and over and over again. And what they want is to drive, and they're fully capable of driving. And that work has to be supported. Their time and their effort has to be valued. And so the partnering with the foundation, or being a foundation in this case, is really important. And whether, if we were here writing that theory of change, we're paying our people for that, and we owe the residents that compensation when they're doing that work. And so I think I agree with you that you have to compensate people, and you have to value their time and their intellect and their contribution. In addition, in terms of the evaluation question, We don't think that's our job. We think that the community needs to teach us about how will they know when this is successful or not. And so that means that they also have to think about what are the things that are going to tell them that something's working or not working. And then we can support that in saying, well, let's think about how we measure that, how we might get to that. And we find great, just really great insight coming from residents around that. They know what success looks like.
Thank you, Gwen. This is Michelle Holt-Shannon with New Hampshire Listens at the Carsey School of Public Policy. I wanted to follow up on Gwen's comments. Am I being heard?
Yes.
So we see ourselves as a place-based intermediary of place-based intermediaries, I would say. And it's interesting based on the structure in the beginning of the call that Gwen shared. We founded New Hampshire Listens about 5 years ago, and we're thinking sort of the statewide work, and have done a lot more to refocus on having local partners around the state, who are out doing the work, who are driving, as Gwen says, and that has been sort of our blinding flash of the obvious, I guess, is when we imagined trying to earn trust as a convener and as an intermediary at the statewide level. We can't do that without having really strong relationships locally, and so it's been sort of investing in that, in local communities. In terms of our time and effort, and then also having partners with us, spread out all over the state, who are trying to do the work of problem solving differently, in ways that your Keystones really share. Here, all voices, cross sectors, and the thoroughfares. So. I can't touch it right now.
Malka, I see you trying to talk, but we can't hear you. Are you on mute?
No. See her all done. Oh, there she is.
Hear us, Kristen? No, I guess not.
I can hear you.
Okay. I just wanted to know if you could say a little bit about kind of New Hampshire Listens.
A little bit about New Hampshire Listens. Was that the question, to share a little bit about New Hampshire Listens?
She's talking.
Bruce, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I can share more, but I didn't get the end of the question.
Wouldn't you know, technology has been working so well for 54 minutes that it's
I know.
starting on now. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I heard the end of the question that somebody had about New Hampshire Listens. And how it has changed over the years. Bruce, are you still on? I think you shared a couple of links around that. Might be somebody who could speak to that.
How it's changed over the years.
Yes, yeah, both Michelle Holt-Shannon and I are on together here from the New Hampshire Listens penthouse at UNH. How have we changed? What Michelle was emphasizing was we began by supporting conversations across the entire state about statewide policy issues or long-range planning issues, everything from transportation infrastructure to long-term sustainability of water supplies, to enhanced revenue opportunities for the state. Recently convened a statewide conversation on the growing opportunity gap and income inequality. We participated in creating community solutions around mental health and substance abuse. All those were statewide conversations that took place simultaneously in multiple communities across the state involving hundreds of folks, all sharing the same framing questions and data to try to identify potential responses or policy actions that could occur at the state level. In order for that to be successful, what we've discovered, and gladly so, is there needs to be local capacity, community by community across the state, so people are in the habit of engaging using, in our case, small group facilitated face-to-face dialogue that combines understanding data with the articulation of personal values and community norms and traditions. So building, it's a bottom-up and top-down process at the same time. It's using the infrastructure model, we're starting to build the bridge on both sides of the river at the same time and trying to meet in the middle as we go, and that takes a lot of fancy engineering. But by attending to both local capacity, where people are trying to solve dangerous intersection problems or how to improve their local high school, with statewide attention to things that link the entire state together, that seems to be a useful form of civic infrastructure in our case, in a relatively small state, 1.3, 1.4 million people.
You described.
Oh, now I see Jill talking, but we can't hear you, Jill. Oh goodness. I think she's typing, so. Malka, can we hear you now at all? Oh,
the vertical thoroughfare, Keystone 3, we need more on that.
Well, we are about at time to wrap up anyway. So I will ask, since we did so well on the text for so long, but glitches seem to inevitably happen. So if Jill and Malka, since we can't hear you right now, if you would maybe in the chat box share with everyone one action that you hope that they might take away from today, or one thing that you hope that they might keep in their minds to think about moving forward. Perhaps that could be a good departing thought to leave us with. So I'll encourage you guys to leave that in the chat box. And while they're doing that, I'm sorry, was there a comment? Well, while they are doing that, I want to thank you all for being part of this discussion today. I think it was really rich and substantive, not only in the discussion that took place in the webinar, but the chat was furiously active with comments and questions and resources, and you guys are just really demonstrating the power of crowds and communities to resource and help each other, which is so much of what civic infrastructure is about in general, and that Jill and Malka have challenged us to be really thoughtful about today. So thank you all for being part of this discussion. A recording of this webinar will be made available. It'll take a little bit of time to process it on our end, but I will post it to pagefunders.org, hopefully tomorrow, but certainly by Friday. And I'll send out an email to everyone who is registered so that you guys will know when you can access that. And I encourage you to stay in touch with us in the future. We'll be doing another webinar in March in partnership with the Presidio Institute, looking at cross-sector leadership in philanthropy and what that means and looks like, incorporating some perspectives from program officers at the Bush Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, and the Irvine Foundation. So more information on that will be forthcoming. And it looks like Jill and Malka are typing their thanks to you all, and I hope we can find ways to keep the conversation going. So please stay in touch, stay engaged, and we look forward to continuing working with you all on this important topic. Thank you all.